Yeah, so welcome for this afternoon session for the New Yorkers, for instance. And so we have a huge world web here. And George said that for him, it's already Monday, for instance. So we have to appreciate that. So it's my pleasure to have, oh yeah, Carole, you're in Grenoble. So for you, it's quite late as well. Yeah, I guess it's 9 p.m.
Yeah,
So it's
9 p.m.
to welcome you here. So I had the pleasure to discover Carole through the Research in Options series, and where she's been a very regular and valuable contributor, and with a very pleasant company as well. So the presentations have always been really interesting and well presented, and I'm pretty sure that we can trust you to keep the high standard. Without further ado, so Carole, please, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot again for this great invitation. Even though it's not in Rio, it still means a lot for me. So I'm very happy to be here to present my research on improving multi-asset allocation.
Sorry to interrupt you. I see a message from Max saying that there are no slides of Carole in YouTube. So I don't know whether...
I see them personally, so I think people who don't see should refresh their YouTube.
Yes, yes. Just appeared.
Sorry for the interruption. You're back.
Okay. So it works?
Yeah, it seems so, yeah.
Yeah, people should refresh their screens to make their screens.
Yeah.
So stop me if there's a problem. Because I don't see the YouTube. So this is a joint work with Luca De Gennaro, who was my PhD student. He had the great pleasure to come to Rio last year. And Steven Wonderful, who is my collaborator for many years and is a professor from Brussels. So Luca actually came last year, and some of you know him because he was in Rio. And I have the pleasure to say that he graduated last month, as you can see, in the middle of the pandemic, with a nice outfit. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about cost efficiency and give some implication for systemic risk. So I'll start with standard cost efficiency, what I did and presented in Rio a few years ago, and I'll move on to an extension that we recently worked on, which is now multivariate cost efficiency. And I'll try to convince you that it's actually interesting and there are many applications. So what is cost efficiency? So cost efficiency is you think of in a one period setting, you have a portfolio that pays you, let's say, XT at maturity. For simplicity for now, we have a complete market. We assume the initial cost is calculated not under the risk-control probability, but under the real-world probability using the stochastic discount factor that I will denote by XIT. And so what does it mean to be cost efficient? It means that you cannot find another strategy that gives you the same distribution at a cheaper cost. And so in terms of optimization, it simply solves a minimum cost strategy over all possible cash flows, portfolios that you could find in the market that would deliver a certain distribution F. And so if I have this strategy, I'm cost efficient. The good thing about this problem is actually super easy to solve. And the solution not only is easy to find, but it's also unique. As soon as XIT is continuously distributed, it is explicit. So you can express it as F minus 1 minus Xi of XIT. So XIT is your state price process, is the stochastic pricing kernel, or you can think of it as the Radon-Nikodym derivative, dq over dp. So XIT is something that is linked to the market. Fxi is the distribution of XIT at maturity. and F is your target distribution. So if you know your target distribution, you also know, in fact, your optimal portfolio, your cheapest portfolio to achieve this distribution, and it's simply given by this formula. And not only it's explicit, it's unique. So is that good to be cost efficient? If we think about an online conference, Rio, yes, it's super good to be cost efficient, but I don't think that many of us actually think that it is an optimal decision to decide to make it online. Everybody would prefer to be actually in Rio. And so, yes, it's good to be cost efficient if you only care about the distribution, about the content of the conference. Yes, maybe the academic content doesn't change too much. But if you care about the states in which the cash flows happen, and not only about the distribution, then actually you don't think it's an optimal strategy. And so if you are interested in that type of content, then you should not look at cost efficiency, or you should deviate from cost efficiency. And so here it is. So who are the people who actually like the portfolios that are cost efficient? These are the portfolios who only care about distributions. And I'm going to just show it on in the expected utility setting, because it's really easy to understand. And if you understand what happens in the expected utility setting in the simplest case, then you could easily understand the generalization and why actually it holds in many more general problems than the expected utility setting. So assume that you have a budget X0, that you aim at maximizing your expected utility of your final payoff XT. Then my claim is that XT must be cost efficient. So what it means, it actually means that it must be of the form of F minus 1 minus F xi of xi that we've seen before, because that's the unique way of writing a payoff that has distribution F. And so why does it have to be cost efficient? Assume that it's not. If it's not, that you can find something with the same distribution that is strictly cheaper. And then, in terms of expected utility, because you only care about the distribution, not the state in which you receive money. So YT and XT star maybe differ in terms of states, but not in terms of distribution. And thus, you have the same expected utility. One is strictly cheaper. So you save some money, you take this cash, you invest it in the risk-free account, for instance, and you will actually generate something that has a strictly higher utility. As soon as you have a utility that's increasing. So that's the only thing I use. I use a utility that's increasing, and then you get automatically that optimal portfolio must be cost efficient. So what I use here is increasing and low invariance. And I haven't used expected utility, in fact. And so it works in with very general preferences. You can include Bayes risk, cumulative prospect theory, and many more fancy objectives to optimize, as soon as they are non-decreasing and low invariance. First order stochastic domains. And so in that case, if you take an investor that has preferences that are increasing and low invariant, then automatically the optimum is cost efficient. And the proof is exactly the same as the expected utility. Some observation, why all these people who have objective functions that are low invariant and increasing, what they care is to receive an optimal payoff that is of this shape. So it means that their F minus 1 and F xi are both a CDF and a quantile. It's increasing function. So this is a decreasing function of xi t. And so the optimal investment of any agent is always decreasing in xi t, which means she receives less in the most expensive states, which are typically the states where the economy is in the states. So when the market goes down, your payoff is actually smaller. So you don't buy protection. Protection is too expensive. And if you go to the cheapest way to achieve a distribution, you invest in calls rather than investing in puts. If all players in the market have low invariance increasing preferences, then they are all decreasing in xi, which means they all have commodity portfolios, which also means that they all lose money at the same time. highest correlation between the different agents, high systemic risk. And that's also what we see. All pension funds, as soon as there is a crisis, whatever the crisis is, they all lose money at the same time. And when you think about systemic regulation, the idea is that you should not just look at the risk of one entity, one agent in the market, but you should look at it as a function of its joint correlated risk with other banks in the market. And so here is the natural extension to a multivariate setting. And what we do, we look at a problem now where we invest, for instance, in D different markets, and we look at minimizing the cost of this investment. But now what I'm going to impose is that these investments have a certain joint distribution. So I don't want them, for instance, to be comonotonic. I want them to have some, let's say, correlation between them, which is not equal to 1. So something that has some diversification, for instance. And so this problem look more complicated because it's a d-dimensional problem, and then there's a d-dimensional distribution here, and we cannot write it as a g-1 of something. But when we look at it a little bit further, if you know the joint distribution of x1, x2, xd, you also know the distribution of the sum. And so if the sum of the xi has a fixed distribution, psi has also a fixed distribution, we're back to the one-dimensional cost efficiency problem that simply says, if it's optimal, then the sum needs to be as negatively correlated with xi, which should be in decreasing order of xi. And that's what makes everything work. So first, if you observe that something is multivariate cost efficient, so it's a solution to this problem, then automatically the correlation between the sum and psi must be minimum. And that's actually what we use to build a small numerical example to build the solution. And so it's not, I would not even say an algorithm, it's just a procedure that is a numerical procedure to approximate as close as you want the optimal multivariate cost efficient payoff. So what you do, you discretize the problem. You take your pricing kernel and you discretize it. So for instance, if it were log normal, you could just take log normal quantiles at level I over n, and you would get values for the pricing kernels that are equally likely. And so I put all these values for the pricing kernels that are, you can think of it as xi takes these n values with equal probabilities. And for the d-dimensional distribution, which is your target distribution, you simulate n simulation and realization of this joint distribution. So you have each row is actually a simulation. You sum these d values, so you have n sums. And now what you do, you reorder these blocks, but just by keeping the joint distribution, because what we want to solve is a problem where the joint distribution is actually fixed. So you keep the joint distribution and you reorganize it in opposite order to the values that appear in the first column. And then that's it. The problem is solved. The last d columns satisfies this. The correlation between the sum and the psi is minimum because what you've done is exactly putting them in opposite order with respect to the sum. And so the last d columns gives you the optimal distribution, and you can just plot it and do whatever you want. It gives you the multivariate cost efficient payoff. Why is it useful? So the first very simple application, most straightforward, would be to take an objective function that is low in variance, a budget, and you assume that your objective function is at least increasing in one of the components, and also that is low in variance. So if you take a different d-dimensional allocation with the same distribution, you would be indifferent between the two. Then you just check. If the sum of xi is decreasing in psi, you actually have a cost-efficient allocation. You cannot improve it further. If it's not decreasing in psi, when you sum your different allocation, then you can strictly improve your allocation by finding a cheaper portfolios that has the same joint distribution. Second application, which is less straightforward and goes not as directly as the one-dimensional application, is the application in terms of reducing systemic risk. Without external constraints, if you think of heterogeneous agents, all have low invariance and increasing preferences, they would all be decreasing in anxiety or increasing in the market portfolio. So they will have, all this group of agents will have comonotonic allocation. The regulator could actually look at this and say, oh, all these banks are actually comonotonic. What I want to do is adding a constraint so that the various agents not only choose their portfolio in isolation, but look at what the others are doing. So trying to impose that they have a certain diversification between them. And I want to quantify how much would it cost to deviate from a comonotonic allocation. So here is an example where you would think, okay, if I take the different utilities and I sum them, for instance, and I solve this maximum utility problem for some budget. In fact, the optimal solution would be everybody would be decreasing anxiety. So even if you don't solve separately the utility of each individual agent, you solve them globally, but still everyone is acting as if is actually acting for himself with his own utility, and they don't care about what the others are choosing. So everyone is actually anti-monotonic with anxiety. If we take an example of these utilities, you could take exponential utility, for instance, and we take exponential utility because everything is simple and then even explicit with that. So if you take a log normal market, so very simple, like Black-Scholes, the agents will all exponential utility. If you solve for their portfolio, you will notice that they all have a normal distribution, and that there is a link between the optimal investment distribution, the parameters of their distribution, and their budget. So this is for the D exponential utility maximizer. If I force them to not be comonotonic, because then if I just sum the utilities, they would all be negatively decreasing anxiety. Now I'm going to force them to be pairwise, having a certain correlation. So what is the cost of enforcing the diversification? So imagine a manager of D agents who understands the global risk and aims at avoiding comonotonic portfolios. So for example, she imposes that the D agents have the same normal CDF, but now with pairwise correlation rho. We can calculate actually it will be more expensive because the constraints, you constrain the problem, you add constraints. So in terms of cost, it will increase the cost. So it will be more expensive. But how much more expensive? You can actually calculate explicitly this cost, and it's linked to the volatilities that you want to achieve and on the correlation. And of course, this extra budget will go to zero if you just want comonotonicity. And so we've done this for different dimensions. And so what we see is that in terms of percentage increase, if you want to have a correlation that goes to zero, the percentage increase is more than 100% as soon as you have 5, 10, or 50 dimensions. Forcing them to be independent will be extremely costly and will cost more than double of the budget that you have. If you just want like 0.8%, maybe it's like 20% extra budget that you need to force a small diversification between the D agents. The third application that we have thought is actually multivariate cost efficiency could be used as an objective function that ensures that the optimal strategies are not comonotonic, because you choose what kind of joint distribution you want to get, and thus it's not, if you don't choose the comonotonicity, it won't be comonotonic distribution. And it's actually easier to think about, okay, what kind of target distribution would I want in terms of D dimension, rather than thinking, okay, what is my D dimensional utility function? we know already that it's super hard to interpret what is a utility function in one dimension, but in D dimension is even more difficult to interpret, like what does it mean a multivariate utility function. And if really you want to stay with the multivariate utility function because you like expected utility, then you need to find a multivariate utility function that leads to optimal allocation that are not comonotonic. And that's also one thing that we've been able to do. And another natural application would be then to use this objective function, this multivariate utility function that doesn't lead to comonotonicity as an objective for collective decision making or robo-advisor regulation. If you have a pension funds that make decision for many agents, then it's maybe best for the full fund to not act comonotonic for each agent. And so this is the way we're thinking of it. So in the case of the multivariate normal distribution, it's a special case where everything is explicit. In fact, you can construct this multivariate cost-efficient payoff not only with the numerical procedure I gave, but also explicitly. So we verified, in fact, that the numerical procedure works great. And we've done this with some spatial correlation metrics where after applying the procedure, we actually check that our optimum has indeed this correlation matrix and they are Gaussian. And also that when you sum them, you're negatively correlated with the log of psi t. So this is this anti-monotonicity that is needed to ensure multivariate cost efficiency. The sum needs to be anti-monotonic with psi. And then each variable is actually negatively correlated with psi, but not as strongly as if it were just a line as it is when each agent acts independently. So finally, I just want to give a small hint of what do we think, how do we think about the problem of designing preferences that enforce diversification. So what we had in a paper in 2015, so some time ago, is that each time you have a distribution, you can find a utility such that your optimum has exactly this distribution of wealth. The utility was explicit, unique, so it was really nice. And we thought, okay, if we have a multivariate distribution, can we find a multivariate utility function that solves this problem? And the answer is very tricky. We haven't solved it fully for now. What we have is that the objective function, if it exists, will not be unique. For some general multivariate CDF, we don't know exactly how to construct this utility function. And so we don't know actually if it exists. And we have a way to construct, for instance, utility function that would lead to multivariate Gaussian distribution. So this is, for instance, the shape of a utility function that will lead to an optimum, which will have some correlation. And you can see it's a state-dependent utility function that depends on the value of the pricing kernel at time t/2. So we expect that there will be applications in the future, and we hope at least that there will be applications. So to conclude, we've developed this natural extension of cost efficiency to a multivariate setting. We propose to use this multivariate objective to make a smart collective decision making that does not lead to comonotonic allocation. Could be used, for instance, to regulate systemic risk, to make collective decisions safer or smarter, at least not comonotonic. And so maybe I'll just thank you for listening. And I want also to thank especially for Marco and Bruno and George for organizing this conference for so many years. And want to say happy birthday to Marco and thank you for taking us to Buzios. This is the place where, thanks to him, he organized not only a great academic program, but also surf lessons. So this was a very good memory from that time. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carole. So again, if you want to post questions on the YouTube, so that's the right time because actually we just have a short time. So as I think I'm still waiting for the questions now. So let me start with my own one. So if I understand, everybody has the same view. So we are not talking about risk neutral pricing, because with concave utility functions, then optimal thing would be to do nothing, because you don't gain anything in expectation if it's a risk neutral, and you just create variance. So it's not risk neutral pricing, but from what I understand, everybody is supposed to have the same probability measure. So do you know how if the different people, for instance, the head trader if they have different probabilities? So do you know how it's affecting your results?
Yeah, we're starting to work on this. Like if you have, it's another extension that we're deriving with Stephen also, on the possibility to have an ambiguity setting in which different people believe on a different probability P, but still they agree on the market prices. So the Q is given by options, by the market. So the Q, you agree on it, it's kind of objective, but the P in which you make your utility decision and in which you assess your distribution is subjective. Mm-hmm. And some of the results can be extended, and it goes back to the link between, so there is, you can still solve some robust cost efficiency problem, and that will link to max mean expected utility problems. Mm-hmm. So there is a link between the two.
Okay, so thank you very much, Carole. Now it's 3:30.